Can everybody see the screen okay?
You're good.
All right. Thank you so much for having me. Thank you for that nice intro, Glenn. Really excited to talk to you folks about some birds that are very near and dear to my heart here in the islands. Um, Obviously, the first slide is me working with an EEV here in the Alakai Swamp on the island of Kauai. I figured I would just start with a brief introduction of the islands. I'm assuming it's a new place for a lot of you. Maybe not, but I just wanted to show you a map of the islands because most of the time when we think of Hawaii, we're thinking about the inhabited islands, the vacation destinations. A lot of us as birders and conservationists dream of going up to the northwestern Hawaiian Islands, which used to be open at one point to ecotourism, but just trying to give you an overview that it's not just the 8 inhabited islands at the bottom of the archipelago. You know, this chain of islands is over 137 rocks, reefs, atolls, and little islands extending over 1,200 miles here in the Pacific, and obviously one of the most isolated groups of islands in the entire world. When most of us think of Hawaii, we think of Hawaiian honey creepers. They're definitely the iconic family group of birds. They are descended from finches in Southeast Asia. It's kind of hard to believe today, but at one time we had over 54 species of Hawaiian honey creepers. And most of the time we think of the EEV going for nectar from some of our native flowers. But if you look at this design, or I should say illustration by Douglas Pratt, you can see that some of these birds evolved to crack different sized seeds, similar to Darwin's finches in the Galapagos. We have Hawaiian honey creepers specifically that are insectivores. And most of what we still encounter throughout the islands today are our generalists, like that amakihi up at the top center, number 17. Sadly, we've lost a lot of Hawaiian honey creepers. I would say we're down to about a dozen. You know, there's an ongoing debate for how long people don't see or hear something before we believe it's gone. I know as a guide, one of the rules is don't bring up the ivory-billed woodpecker. I'd like to think that some of these birds are in deep, impenetrable forests in places like Kauai, but we'll talk more about the plight of these Hawaiian birds as we go on. Another group of another family of birds here in the islands are the monarch flycatchers. If you've been through the islands with me, you know I don't just call them elapaio, I call them cutie pios. They definitely make up for personality and charisma, even though they don't have bright, showy feathers or plumage like our Hawaiian honey creepers. These guys are in a family called monarch flycatchers. I heard Glenn talking about Australia. If you get down to Tassie, you'll get to see some monarchs there. If you've been to Papua New Guinea, it's a different family of flycatchers in the old world. We also have thrushes here in the islands. So the one that most of us can still encounter in the top left corner of the screen there is the oma'o, found only on the Big Island. The pueohi in the top right corner, tragically, has a population probably less than, sorry about that, probably has a population of less than 300 birds. The kama'o down in the bottom right-hand corner was last sighted back in 1986. And of course, the thrushes on Maui and Oahu are sadly long gone. These guys are descended from Townsend solitaire, which I finally got to see in Tucson last winter. We have an array of water birds here. You know, our flightless rails are gone, and some of our large flightless geese. Obviously, they were food for whoever arrived to the islands first. We know that the Polynesians arrived here in Hawaii probably about 1400 years ago, originally from the Marquesas Islands before people from Tahiti, Samoa, Fiji, Tonga, Polynesians from all over the Pacific started arriving here. Hawaiian coot is still a bird we can see. Nene have thankfully been a true success story. We don't have a lot of birds of prey. It's hard to imagine now, but we would have had tons of different kinds of raptors, similar something to a white-tailed eagle. There's an illustration of an extinct group of owls called stilt owls that had very short wings and long legs, so they could easily catch birds in thick, dry, and wet forests. We do have a subspecies of short-eared owl endemic to the islands, which is very diurnal. We say pueo here in the islands. And you can see our small buteo there, our eo or Hawaiian hawk, is an endangered bird and only here on the Big Island. We did have some corvids. I'm happy to report to all of you folks that the alala or Hawaiian crow reintroduction is finally going well on Maui. Basically what happened was with reintroductions here on the Big Island, with a group of birds that have only ever been in captivity most of their lives, teaching them predator avoidance on an island with Hawaiian hawk was definitely a challenge for not just the researchers, but also for the crows. I believe Maui Forest Bird Recovery Project is still monitoring about half a dozen individuals in remote areas, unfortunately not accessible to us as the public and as birders, but hopefully that will change and the reintroduction will continue. So far, it's been a success. Obviously, no Hawaiian hawk hunting alala on Maui. One of my new favorite groups of birds, I'm originally from Pennsylvania, so it's kind of still crazy to me after being here for 10 years that I get to share things like mole or Laysan albatross. And right now we've got nesting wedge-tailed shearwaters on the islands. A lot of these seabirds, not just here in the inhabited islands, but up into the northwestern Hawaiian Islands, are, I call them near endemics. You know, some of these birds are on smaller islands around the edges of Japan and across the Pacific off the coast of Mexico. But we're talking over 95% of the population of a lot of these seabirds. Things like the Laysan albatross, black-footed albatross, bone-and petrel, Tristram storm petrel. We finally found evidence of band-rump storm petrels nesting here on the Big Island on Mauna Loa after over 40 years of searching. Great frigate birds, obviously, red-footed brown and masked booby. Oh, and I guess I should have added cocos now that we've got that split. And our Hawaiian petrel and Newell's shearwater are true endemics, only breeding here in the Hawaiian Islands. So what I wanted to highlight with you folks are some of the challenges that our birds are facing. And I'm sure you're all familiar with what's happening here in Hawaii as it's happened on other small islands throughout the Pacific, and even in places like the Caribbean and the Galapagos, depending on which islands we're specifying. But habitat loss is a big one. If you visited Honolulu, you know that island of Oahu has probably over 1 million people on it any given day. The city is densely populated with over 700,000 people. That's not including all of our visitors and our men and women with a military branch there. But, you know, over time, as more people arrived to the islands, we ended up with more introductions of plants and animals from other places. The biggest challenges for us working in bird conservation are non-native rats small Indian mongoose, feral cats, and even pigs. As soon as people started arriving to the islands, they accidentally brought rats. As more people started coming, especially fair-skinned foreigners, you know, more rats arrived. The Polynesians brought pigs, dogs, and chickens for food. And small Indian mongoose, cats, and even barn owls were brought in to try and control the rodent population, which unfortunately is just causing more problems for a lot of our nesting birds, especially our seabirds. Diseases are unfortunately what's wiping out a lot of our Hawaiian honey creepers today. I like to try and give you the analogy of thinking of the Hawaiian people here living on the islands before anybody else arrived, before any Westerners came. Most of us have learned Captain Cook was one of the first Westerners that we know of to arrive in 1778. And, you know, before that, we had at least 800,000 Hawaiian people, Polynesians already living here throughout the islands. A lot of people say, a lot of anthropologists believe, I should say, that that population could have been close to 1 million. You know, when Captain Cook first arrived, he estimated about 400,000 people. He didn't sail all the way around. This was his first trip, right, before he got into trouble. So what's happening today is a lot of our Hawaiian forest birds don't have any immunity to foreign diseases like avian pox and avian malaria, just like our native Hawaiian people didn't have much immunity to foreign diseases. We went from over 800,000 Hawaiian people to less than 50,000. And I was commenting earlier how we've gone from over 54 species of Hawaiian honey creepers to tragically less than 16, more like 14. Climate change is real. I can't believe I'm saying this. I'm 41 years old, but I've watched it here across the islands just within the past 5 years. Gradually, in this part of the North Pacific, we're noticing warmer and drier temperatures, and it's definitely affected the spread of disease with non-native mosquitoes reaching higher elevations, which I'll talk to you a little bit more about. And, you know, any catastrophic event, I heard the tsunami warning for the first time in 10 years, about a month and a half ago. That was terrifying. Any big storm, I'm sure you folks all heard about the tragic fires in Lahaina on Maui a few years ago. It's kind of terrifying when you realize how isolated these small populations of birds are in the few native forested areas left that are protected, very vulnerable in this island ecosystem. So from here, I'd like to just take you a little bit through the islands. We can kind of island hop together through the slides with some of my favorite birds. The Oahu Island endemics, you can see the Oahu amakihi there on the left, and one of my favorite birds, the Oahu elepaio on the right. So these are birds that are specifically only found on Oahu. I've worked extensively with Pacific Rim Conservation on the Oahu elepaio project, which is why it's one of my favorite birds. And the really cool thing about these two species is they've somehow built up a resistance to avian malaria and avian pox, which has wiped out most of the other birds across the island. So that's why these two passerines are still on the island of Oahu. A little bit about the recovery project with Pacific Rim Conservation. Just showing you a map here of how isolated some of these populations are, and you know how drastically the population has dropped over time. I am happy to report to all of you that the population has gone from about 1,200 to 1,300 individuals, again, only found on this island. When you're looking at the map and you see the west side there, you can see that Schofield West Ridge. Most of that mountain range is actually part of Schofield Army Barracks, with Phil Taylor overseeing the project there. Eric Vanderwerf started the Oahu Alapaio Recovery Project when he was a student at University of Hawaii. And it's amazing just what can be done when you know where the birds are, when they're breeding. Better yet, if you can find a nest, so we can try and control the rat populations in those areas during breeding. I know it kind of sounds crazy because obviously we're never going to eradicate all of these invasive predators on the island. But with these A24 or good nature traps that our friends in New Zealand have been using for decades, it's actually working quite well. The Oahu Alapaio basically defend a territory of just 2 to 2.5 acres their entire lives. And as I said, they can be pretty charismatic. They're also one of my favorite birds as a professional guide because they're one of the few that's inquisitive and sometimes comes over to look at you, which is a lot of fun. But take a look at this trap. It's got a CO2 cartridge on it. It's even got a synthetic chocolate bait canister on top. So when you get into some really remote terrain and, you know, just impenetrable luhe ferns and really dense non-native guava forest, which you can see me standing in there, there's a really high density of rats in these areas. So the Alapaio make this adorable little cup-shaped nest. They line it with spider webs and lichens and moss. It kind of looks like a giant hummingbird nest. They've adapted to a completely non-native forest. They're obviously opportunistic about feeding, but they're very vulnerable to rats. The rats can climb the trees in a matter of seconds, takes eggs, chicks, and unfortunately, the female who's incubating. I've been monitoring a territory with Pacific Rim for over 9 years now. And it's just so much fun to watch because the first 6 years I worked on this project, the male in that territory was all alone. And over time, I think it was 2 seasons ago now, he finally got himself a wife. And I really do need to finish my blog on just the Oahu Alapaio soap opera that my guests and new friends have been observing with me over the years. But you know, nesting success goes from less than 33% to over 67%. So basically, once you attach one of those traps to the tree, you know, the rat will try and climb up and go after that synthetic chocolate bait, and the sensor will go off and a pin will fire immediately with that CO2 cartridge right at the base of the skull of the rat. So it's an instant humane death, and this trap can go off 24 times before we have to restock it. I will say that it's a very expensive trap. So we do still have some old school snap traps, But again, you're only going to increase the population of Alapaio as you have more territories with more predator control. So we've got about 4 to 5 traps in each 2.5 acre territory. And I also just have to share another awesome fact about these little Oahu Alapaio. You know, these guys haven't just built up a resistance to avian malaria and avian pox, but they've got some really neat adaptations with foraging, from hanging like a chickadee, flipping leaves like a towhee, going down like a nuthatch, up like a creeper. They really are adaptive little birds. So I'm just so happy that thanks to Pacific Rim Conservation, Oahu Alapaio is still an endemic you all have a chance to look for and help us protect. One of my favorites in Honolulu is the white tern. So just a reminder, don't skip over Honolulu. As far as we know, this is the only place within the inhabited islands that white terns are breeding. It's so bizarre to see them sitting in trees amongst all of the high rises and the skyscrapers. They just lay one egg on the crook of a branch. They'll incubate for a little over a month, and both parents will switch off with incubating and feeding. And you know, we were trying to figure out as bird enthusiasts and some of our Audubon members just trying to figure out when the breeding season was so we could let all the city workers know, don't trim the trees from this day to that day or during these months. And what we found was white terns breed all year round. We're starting to see more of them on our pelagics here in Kona, which is exciting. Even some of them coming down to the Puna side of the Big Island. So who knows, maybe they'll continue expanding throughout the inhabited islands. Where they can avoid rats in the trees, they seem to be very happy and proliferating. One of the other projects I got to work with Pacific Rim Conservation on Oahu is their seabird translocation. It's hard to imagine today, but if you read some of the early accounts of explorers visiting the islands back with whaling ship times, really early on, naturalists, the sky would turn black with seabirds. And it's so sad how many of these seabirds we've lost over time. And it sounds kind of backwards to be moving birds from uninhabited islands to inhabited islands. Now, I've never been to the Northwestern Hawaiian Islands, but my friends who get to work on conservation projects there have taught me that the highest elevation on Midway is just 3 meters high. So one big storm, one big wave, again, the stochastic events. This is basically an insurance population that my friends with Pacific Rim Conservation have created on the north shore of Oahu on a national wildlife refuge called James Campbell. This is in Kahuku, if you're familiar with the island. And they've actually partnered with the with US Fish and Wildlife, and they were moving seabirds off of Midway that they knew were nesting way too low, basically below the sand dunes, and brought them all the way back to the island of Oahu. This is inside a big predator-proof fence, so all of the invasive predators within the fence have been removed. The seabird chicks were translocated and cared for by Pacific Rim staff. Shout out to Robbie Coley. He's a very good avian aviculturist and seabird daddy. And, you don't spend a lot of time with these birds, but they've created what looks and sounds like a seabird colony. So they've got decoys out that look like seabirds. They've got the speakers going on a timer with solar powered batteries. And even though you might have seabirds investigate, most of these guys, like our Hawaiian sea turtles, instinctively return to the same place they fledged from. So by moving these chicks to an area like James Campbell National Wildlife Refuge, which is now protected with this predator-proof fence, our hope is that after these birds fledge, because they don't spend any time with their parents when they fledge, it's all instinct, that they'll return to breed. And I'm so happy to tell you guys that we now have black-footed albatross circling around the north shore of Oahu from November through May into June. In fact, last year was the first time that we've ever recorded or know about a black-footed albatross fledging a chick from an inhabited island. So our babies are back, and we're all very proud grandparents that this project is working. So it started with Laysan albatross. You can see the black-footed albatross chick there. They've even expanded the project with bone-in petrel and Tristram storm petrel. So hopefully these are birds that we'll get to encounter on some of our pelagics soon, I hope. Just some other birds that you might not think about when you think about Hawaii. Some of the introduced birds like the red-vented bulbul down in the bottom right-hand corner. We get a lot of visiting shorebirds. It's a really exciting thing to see bristle-thighed curlews and, pectoral and sharp-tailed sandpipers hanging out. I'm really excited. It's fall migration now. I was chasing after birds this morning. Birds you might not think about being on the islands are introductions like yellow-faced grassquit. There was even an introduction of Mariana swiftlets at one point, and I just couldn't help but put another photo of a beautiful white tern or mano oku there. I'm going to move on to Kauai. These are birds that are specifically only found on this island. In the top left-hand corner, you can see the little ani owl. This is one of the smallest Hawaiian honey creepers we have left. Our endemic Kauai elapaio there, top center. Our Kauai amakihi, top right. And I'll just keep going down in a circle. Bottom right is the akekee, the puaiohi, bottom center, our small Kauai thrush, and our akakiki, bottom left. Of these 6 endemics, I've sadly watched 3 of them become very, very difficult to track down. The akakiki in the bottom left-hand corner, sadly, we think there's just a few individuals in the wild. Justin Height is a good friend of mine who's worked extensively with the Kauai Forest Bird Recovery Project on this particular species. He's now thankfully involved with our Birds Not Mosquitoes program with the state of Hawaii. And I'll talk more about what's happening on the island to try and save Anianiao and Kauai amakihi. The akakee numbers are insanely low. I'm not sure if anybody has an actual estimate because even before the birds became so difficult to find, their foraging behaviors make them difficult to track down as well. You know, they tend to forage at the very top of the canopy, and you often just get part of the bird sticking out. Even Kauai amakihi has become difficult for me to track down as a guide on the island. So Kauai Forest Bird Recovery Project obviously does a lot of just monitoring, you know, trying to collect blood samples and, you know, feather samples and fecal samples, because these are the birds, a lot of them, that are under serious threat from avian malaria and avian pox. And the vector for the diseases is small mosquito, the small house mosquito. So, you know, we can continue to elaborate and expand the predator-proof fencing and ungulate fencing, bringing back native plants. We can continue to expand the rat trap grid. But tragically, on the island of Kauai, just within the past 5 years, we've all watched the mosquitoes that normally breed at low to mid elevation, again, not native, they don't have any advantage or don't serve any purpose within our ecosystem in the islands. We've watched them reach the highest peak on the island of Kauai, sadly. Where I'm talking about, you can see the Alakai Swamp Preserve there. This is state property. And this is, again, another nonprofit doing most of the work. So this is what's happening right now. Biologists think that they've tracked down the very first mosquito introduction in the islands to a big whaling ship back in the 1800s. And again, you have to remind yourself that with a group of islands so isolated, the only native terrestrial vertebrates we had were rats, or were not anything like rats or pigs. They were basically just bats and birds. So all of these things are really wreaking havoc on our ecosystem. And this Birds Not Mosquitoes campaign launched by the state finally got permission just this year in 2025 to start releasing mosquitoes that have been altered in a lab situation. So let me just clarify on this, and I'll do my best to explain this, even though I'm not the scientist. I'm just trying to give you an overview of all of these amazing projects happening through all of my friends. So we know that, you know, this Culex genus of mosquito is spreading diseases to our birds. We know they're not native. We know they've reached the highest elevation on the island. So unfortunately, these birds under serious threat without any immunity to foreign disease like our iconic EEV. Basically, if an infected bird or carrier, like those cute little red-crested cardinals all over the beach parks, gets bit by one of the mosquitoes, that same mosquito goes and bites something like our EEV that doesn't have any immunity or resistance. Tragically, these birds die very quickly, probably less than a week. So we know GMOs are not going to get support here in the islands. It has a lot to do with what's happened culturally here amongst people, especially on the island of Kauai with a very heavy Monsanto presence over the years. But we do know that there's a bacteria naturally found in the environment called Wolbachia. So basically, our scientists have figured out which strain of Wolbachia is on the native or on the non-native mosquitoes. And once they figure out which strain that is, they then use this Wolbachia bacteria with a different strain. So a different strain of Wolbachia on the same species of mosquito in the lab situation. So basically, when those males are released into the wild with a different strain of this Wolbachia bacteria, you've now got the next generation of being completely sterile. And, you know, this is something that people have done with GMO mosquitoes in different parts of the world where we're very concerned about, you know, mosquito-borne diseases being transmitted to people, to humans, of course. This is a really expensive project. I know the first initial drop in February by several, you know, helicopters, not just on Kauai, but also on Maui, you know, to get this project finally running and to finally get the funding. We're talking $5 million for over 500,000 mosquitoes being dropped over these specific breeding areas for, again, Anianiao, Kauai-a-Makihi, Akakee, Akakiki, Elapaio, and Pueo here, thankfully not as affected as some of the Hawaiian honey creepers are for these introduced diseases. You know, now I know the project is using drones. My biggest fear is obviously the money allotted for this project was from our last administration. So we've probably got another 1.5 years worth of money to continue this process. I'm not an entomologist, but we all know that mosquitoes have a very short lifespan. So this is not a once and done thing. This is going to be an ongoing expense. And that first drop was $5 million. So this is something that, you know, we're going to continue to be pioneering here in the Hawaiian Islands. And I'm sure you've seen a lot of press about it. We've been getting a lot of support from the American Bird Conservancy as well. Just trying to continue to eradicate these mosquitoes to save the few birds that are left on Kauai. I think it will continue to do well with some of the endemics on Maui. You can see the Maui parrotbill up in the top left-hand corner, our akohe, our crested honey creeper in the center there, and our Maui alawahio on the top right. These are the 3 birds that are still only found on the island of Maui, and similar, well, the same basically technique being done, trying to eradicate mosquitoes. Thankfully on Maui, much younger island than Kauai, the elevation, you know, Haleakala is close to 10,000 feet above sea level. Obviously we lose the tree line at some point about 9,000 feet. But what we found is if we can establish a protected native forest above 5,000 feet above sea level, right now, that's still a mosquito-free or vector-free zone for some of our last forest birds, for some of our last Hawaiian honey creepers. On Maui, if any of you have visited Haleakala, that visitor center, you're over 7,000 feet. A lot of us don't include Maui on our birding trips. Unfortunately, the Nature Conservancy still has the Waikamoi Preserve completely shut down. That's really the only accessible area where you can still hope to glimpse a parrotbill, which probably has a population of about 100 individuals now. I'm not sure about the Akohe population, but probably less than 1,200 individuals. Maui Alawahio, if you're lucky, you can still encounter in the park. And then, our more generalists there, you can see the iconic Iiwi. This is the Hawaii Amakihi species, and the Apapane on the bottom right, thankfully does have resistance to avian malaria and avian pox. So I just wanted to highlight that these are also birds benefiting from the Birds Not Mosquitoes program launched by the state. Going back to Kauai, just to highlight some seabird projects again with my friends at Pacific Rim Conservation. There was also a translocation of Hawaiian petrel and Newell shearwater. Again, these are our endemic seabirds. Reports of encountering something like a Newell shearwater out of the islands, unless you're on a boat in Micronesia, which is where we believe most of them go when they are fledging and, spending their lives at sea, is pretty unlikely. Even my friends in New Zealand have rarely encountered Newell's shearwater. I think the records are still less than 5 sightings. So these truly are our endemics, and they are going into burrows in the forest, which is totally different from our albatross nesting in areas along the coastlines, our red-tailed tropic birds nesting in cliffs. These guys are going deep into the forest and creating a burrow underground. So what Pacific Rim has done here is you can see that predator-proof fence with Megan and I. They've actually created a burrow setting for the birds under the ground. And this translocation has worked. We're really excited that we do finally have Hawaiian petrels coming back as adults to breed. And Newell's shearwater populations are so low, but the island of Kauai does have more seabirds nesting because this island thankfully does not have small Indian mongoose as an introduced predator. Other issues facing these guys are just steady streams of bright light. If you've been to the island of Kauai, you might have seen the little reflectors that flicker on our power lines at night to try and prevent these birds from hitting power lines. Thankfully, there's no big high rises on Kauai like Honolulu. Can't build higher than a coconut palm. But habitat degradation and introduced predators is a real threat. The good thing is these birds are slowly starting to make a comeback with the predator-proof fencing. One thing we didn't think would be such a problem are introduced barn owls, believe it or not, will come after a lot of our seabirds, especially some of the smaller species like the Bonin petrel and Tristram storm petrel. And again, this predator-proof fencing is totally different from, something you'd have to keep your dog in the yard or a pig out of the forest. Perhaps you've seen this in Australia or New Zealand if you've visited, but the wire mesh openings on the fence are smaller than the width of your index finger. So not even a mouse can squeeze through this fence. The fencing goes deep under the ground, so nobody can burrow underneath. And there's even an awning on the fence, so nobody can climb up, over, and around. Really expensive, but once it's in place and you've got some dedicated technicians like Pacific Rim Conservation does, you really can create a predator-free environment for these birds. And I'm really excited to say that it's working. Some other introduced birds on Kauai: greater necklace laughing thrush, western meadowlark, red avadavat, and some of our natives, that are a lot more common on Kauai than the other islands. Of course, our nene, our Hawaiian goose. I don't know if you folks know, but at one point we had less than 30 individual nene. Thankfully, this is a bird that did really well breeding in captivity. Some of them were even brought all the way to Slimbridge in assistance with captive breeding programs there of other species of waterfowl. They've been reintroduced to Maui, Kauai, and the Big Island, but again, they're doing the best on Kauai without small Indian mongoose. Our white-tailed tropic bird is a resident across the islands. This is the Pacific subspecies. There's actually 6 species of white-tailed tropic birds. And our Hawaiian duck, our koloa. The biggest pure population is actually only on the island of Kauai. Probably less than 800 individuals. Unfortunately, there has been a lot of hybridization with domestic mallards across the other islands. I introduced our Maui endemics to you folks. This is with Maui Forest Bird Recovery Project. And basically what they've done is they've created a whole new habitat for our native forest birds by planting thousands and thousands, hundreds and thousands of our endemic koa trees. That's an endemic acacia. That's one of our canopy tree species. I talked to you about the mosquito control, just removing introduced plants, especially those that are crowding out our natives and our endemics. But this is an ongoing project. And again, we can continue to, you know, protect the native areas and try and suppress the predator populations, but we really need to eradicate the mosquitoes to save the birds left on Maui as well. Some other introduced birds on Maui, things like Eurasian skylark on the top right, red-billed leothrix from the Himalayas in the top center there, orange-cheeked waxbills top left, our little red-crested cardinal, very common across a lot of the islands, bottom center, black francolin. There's been a lot of game birds introduced. And our black-necked stilt is a Hawaiian subspecies, which I think should be a Hawaiian stilt. You can see a lot more black on the head and the neck there. Over to the Big Island, where I'm hosting this presentation from. I'm all excited to go out on a pelagic out of Kailua Kona tomorrow. So these are birds that are only on the Big Island or the island of Hawaii. Top left corner, we've got the Akiapola owl. This guy fills the niche of a woodpecker. It's kind of crazy that woodpeckers, kingfishers, these families of birds never made it to this part of the Pacific. These guys will actually use that mandible, the lower part of the bill, to pierce a hole in our koa and our ohia lehua trees. And they'll twist and turn, and they'll use that maxilla, the upper part of the bill, like a big long fingernail to pull out longhorn beetle larvae. They're the only bird in the world I've learned about that can do the tweezer thing with the bill. The palila, sadly, is one that I've watched disappear. Top center there, that's one of the last seed-eating Hawaiian honey creepers. Over 90% of their diet is mamane seeds. Our Elapaio trifecta here, this is the helomorph of the Hawaii Elapaio species. On the bottom left-hand corner, you can see the alavi. That's the Hawaiian name for the Hawaii creeper. There's a beautiful bright little orange bird there. That's our akepa. That's an adult male. You can't really tell even in the hand, but they have a very slight cross tip to the bill. You can think of them as little miniature Hawaiian crossbills. That crossed bill tip helps them open very small buds on leaves and flowers to take really small invertebrates and larvae. I already mentioned our oma'o there, bottom right-hand corner, our Big Island thrush, which is thankfully doing okay. Even in Volcanoes National Park, you can still see oma'o. And of course, our eo, our endangered buteo, our Hawaiian hawk. The Palila I mentioned is a bird that I don't know why I had this idea that extinction would be gradual, or maybe it would just become harder and harder to find some of these birds. I guess my focus was so much on the birds on Kauai that when I returned to the Big Island post-COVID, so this is now 2021, I was amazed. There's an area on the dry side of Pu'ula'au, basically the leeward side of Mauna Kea, you can see on the map here. It's just 25 square miles that this bird has left for protected dry forest. And I went from following and monitoring probably 5 different family groups in a really small area to not being able to even hear one. This population really crashed very recently, to the point where it's not a bird I like to advertise. Going up there in over 24 trips, I had one very brief sighting, and it was very frustrating. I could see the bird fly over a group of 14 guests with field guides all looking the wrong way. I've talked to Brett Mossman, who's very involved with this project here on the Big Island, and I'm really excited that finally there's going to be some more ungulate fence installation. It's been really frustrating that this was one of the first birds put on the endangered species list right after the act was created. And unfortunately, with non-native, not just pig, but this island also has mouflon sheep and goats all over the place. So, with these introductions for hunting, without protecting this Palila habitat, these birds are having a very difficult time. And we think what happened over the past few years is basically the dry forest. Yes, it's supposed to be dry, but it got way too dry. And with a prolonged severe drought like that, the plant stress can continue for years following the drought, the intense drought. And we think that perhaps the Palila dropped too low on the slopes of Mauna Kea in search of green mamane seeds. So not only are these seeds over 90% of their diet, they need a green seed pod. So without enough moisture up on Mauna Kea, these really stressed plants are not able to produce seed pods for our endemic Palila to eat. Brett ensured that there's more mamane planting happening. There's going to be an expanse of an ungulate enclosure for Palila, even more about captive breeding, which has been happening with some of our Hawaiian honey creepers and thrushes in the past with partnerships with San Diego Zoo Global. And, even reintroductions with a massive aviary in that area eventually. So some of these birds can have another chance at a better protected area. Hakalau Forest, let's end on a good note, friends. This is probably one of my most favorite places in the whole wide world. This is a national wildlife refuge. Now we're on the windward side, the wet side of Mauna Kea here on the Big Island. And this is a place that basically was an overgrown cattle pasture when my mentors started doing some of the early forest bird surveys. We're talking early 70s, late 60s under the direction of Mike Scott. And my friend and mentor, Jack Jeffrey, who you can see his photo there of the EEV, was one of the first, was one of the people going in here to do these forest bird surveys. And what Timothy Burr and Jack Jeffrey and, these pioneering biologists found was that in some of these areas where we had glacial gulches, that's right, we had glaciers here on Mauna Kea 10,000 years ago, they've carved out some areas where ungulates couldn't easily get to. So they actually found a lot of endemic, critically endangered birds in this habitat. Again, you're above 5,000 feet above sea level, so you're above where the mosquitoes are. And you've got some remnants of old growth forest. Some of our Ohia lehua trees are some of the oldest angiosperms on Earth. Jack taught me that some of the trees in this refuge are over 1,200 years old. So the fact that this officially became a national wildlife refuge in 1985, it's so amazing. This is one of the only places I've ever learned about in my 10 years here where native forest bird populations have increased and not decreased. And again, that's because of constant management with predator-proof fencing to ensure that that is intact around the refuge, nonstop work with technicians within the refuge, catching feral cats, rats, mongoose, and thankfully, you know, this area, again, about 6,400 feet above where the mosquito problem currently is. Some other birds you can see on the Big Island, things like lavender waxbill, white-faced ibis, any ABA listers, chestnut-bellied sandgrouse is a code 3 bird here in Waikoloa on the Big Island. You can see some other game birds that were introduced on the bottom right there, Kalige pheasant. Again, our short-eared owl with expanses of ranch lands and cattle pastures here are very happy, and I'm happy as a guide that they're very diurnal. And yellow-billed cardinal, which actually has an orange bill, is on this island, different than the red-crested on the others. And some other ABA birds that count that are just not birds that I thought would be here. Saffron finch, Japanese bush warbler, warbling white-eye, Chinese huame, white-rumped shama, chestnut munia. So lots of introduced birds we can still have fun searching for. Again, some of the only places you'd find them technically on your ABA list if you play that game. And I just wanted to mention again, you know, the nonprofits, the groups of people actually doing the work here in the islands to protect the birds that I've worked with in the past. I'm happy to continue volunteering with Pacific Rim Conservation, Kauai Forest Birds, Maui Forest Birds, Friends of Hakalau Forest. Our Hawaii Wildlife Center does an amazing job with rehabilitation and just some other things you folks can do to try and help our birds. And with that, that's my hour. I'd like to open it up to questions here.
You can put your questions right into the chat. Oh, so I've got some of your future trip joiners are in the audience. We're happy to have that. Welcome. Let's see, any questions from anybody? No, we're a little quiet tonight. Have any endemic insectivores learned to feed on mosquitoes? That's an interesting question.
Oh, not that we know of, but that would be great. I can say that the Oahu Elapaio, they will grab mosquitoes. They're very opportunistic about eating some nasty bugs.
These are really, I mean, remarkable birds. It's like among the most exciting birding moments I've ever had have been, you know, seeing some of these native Hawaiian birds.
Yeah. And I should also mention how long-lived these passerines are. I mean, that Aki, we say Aki for short, the Akiapola Au in Hakalau Forest. I mean, there's an individual in there that's got to be over 18 years old. So unfortunately, a lot of their life history doesn't support, you know, bouncing back from the brink of extinction either. You know, when you have a bird so specialized like an Aki or Kiwikiu, that's Maui parrotbill, they're laying one egg maybe every other year, and that one chick can spend over a year with its parents just learning how to forage for insects and learning how to use that bill.
Are any of the introduced birds mosquito eaters?
Um, I would think so, but probably not enough to make a real dent in the problem areas. Um, a lot of the introduced birds are found at lower elevation. When you get into areas like Hakalau or on the Big Island or Haleakala on Maui, you do still have like Japanese bush warbler up in the mountains and like, believe it or not, northern cardinals here too. And a lot of those warbling white-eyes. I would think that they would be opportunistic about foraging on mosquito and mosquito larvae, but again, probably not enough to make an actual dent.
Uh, there was a question here that I thought, oh, it was there was a question about that. Where'd it go? Ah. Oh, why did you first go to Hawaii?
Ah, okay. Um, I ended up here after a tragic divorce. I was very happy to leave the snow and my ex-husband far, far away. Um, and I just bounced around with conservation jobs that were very temporary on the mainland, from Hawk Mountain Sanctuary to the Smithsonian Migratory Bird Center. And I moved here with somebody who used to live here. And I was honestly thinking to myself, what am I doing? There's hardly any birds left. Like, pick anywhere else. And then I started learning about how endangered not just the birds, but a lot of the wildlife is here. Like, over a third of the endangered species in the United States are here in the Hawaiian Islands. And I've just been so passionate about conservation since I was a kid. So even though I couldn't figure out how to financially work for these nonprofits and do nothing else, the guiding has definitely helped with that. And, a lot of the visitors and guests that we've hosted on tours have turned around and given contributions in addition to what my little tour company does from our trips. So it's been kind of a win-win to combine my conservation passion, my bird passion, and sharing new birds with people.
Right.
Who
One
do I go out with for pelagics? Me.
Well, Maureen answered your question already. Who's
Oh,
looking for
okay. I was
volunteers.
gonna say, thanks, Maureen. Mahalo for getting me in touch with Glenn. Mahalo. Yeah, I've been pioneering pelagics in the islands for probably 7 years now. Um, I've been working with a Native Hawaiian captain. She's amazing. She can spot birds we can barely see with our bins. She's just out there fishing every day. And, you know, we finally have a boat with permits and a trained captain, and it's been going really well, but it's still a really expensive charter. So I'm the only one doing it. Please come out with us.
There was a question about, are there places to see endemics in Maui?
Oh, okay. So for Maui, the only place you can really get to is Hosmer's Grove, Hosmer''S Grove. It's a little campground inside Haleakala National Park. And it's really frustrating for us as birders to stand on the other side of the pig fence, looking at the Waikamoi Preserve, and the Nature Conservancy has completely shut down all of their programming for even volunteers to access the preserve to try and see any of those birds. I hope that changes. I really do.
There's a lot to see at Hosmer Grove. I mean,
There is.
it's
And I do think that it's one of the best places for Hawaiian honeycreeper photography. If you're focusing on EEV and Amakihi, Apapane, you can still see the creeper, the Maui Alawahio there. So you can still get those 4 endemics there. And the reason why it's great for photography is Hosmer brought in these non-native pines. So the endemic or native vegetation is actually mamane bushes at eye level. I've actually gotten iPhone video of EEV there in the parking lot. I don't know of anywhere else like that in the islands.
Yeah. That was my experience. That's one of the places I've been in birding in Hawaii, and it was easy. It was like
Yes.
there. It's like you didn't have to work for. I mean, obviously you didn't get any of the really rare ones.
Right. Yeah,
But,
your chances of getting a parrotbill or a kohei there are next to nothing. But it's a very accessible place, and again, our parks need all the support they can get right now. So it's one of our few national parks on the island. So
all right. Well, I think we will call it a night. But thank you all for joining us tonight, and we hope to see you next month. I didn't. Next month is Corky talking about bats. It should be a lot of fun. So, looking forward to that a lot. As Whitney said, we're gonna put our Golden Gate Bat Alliance costume on for for next month. Um, I look forward to seeing you all there. And I think our November is actually going to be in person, which is a little rare for us. But so I hope to see you all there in person. And nice to have a good crowd. I'm not sure where it's going to be. Somewhere in San Francisco, we hope. So have a great evening and a great weekend, and we will see you all out birding sometime